Well, I spoke at the top of the show about what Attorney General Yvette D'Arth said in budget estimates today. She's basically ruled out bringing in mandatory minimum sentencing for youth offending for crimes commonly committed by juveniles like car theft and robbery. Have a listen to what she said earlier.
Every case is different. And the causes behind that offending, the circumstances, whether the individual has a history of offending, the seriousness of offending, what they've done since they've alleged to commit the offence, what have they done, have they acknowledged guilt in relation to that offending, have they sought to rehabilitate, what actions have they taken to, address those issues in their lives, in between the alleged offending and being convicted and sentenced, that the courts will take into account. So when governments of any persuasion start putting in minimum mandatory, what they're saying is that they're taking away the discretion of the courts to consider all of those elements.
So what do you think, 133882, the Palaszczuk government has boasted about their 10-point plan to crack down on youth crime, but they won't go anywhere near minimum mandatory sentencing? I know plenty of our 4BC Drive listeners are very keen on minimum mandatory sentencing. Bond University criminologist and former detective Terry Goldsworthy joins me on the line now. I want to get his reaction and thoughts on this. Terry, what do you make of Yvette D'Arth's comments today?
Well, I think they're interesting. The first aspect that I kind of picked up on, that not once in her reply did she mention the word victim, which would probably much be the approach of this government to some degree. They're offender-centric. The weakening of the laws that we have seen have been designed to benefit offenders, and consideration of victims seems to come a distant second.
It's a great point, and you often do hear about the fact that this government puts offenders first and victims second. What's your thoughts, Terry, on minimum mandatory sentencing? It's a complex area. There are obviously pros and cons. Do you have a belief on that?
Well, we currently have a general crime crisis in Queensland, and it's driven to a large extent by the youth crime crisis within there. So people just need to kind of realise, what are we doing to actually address the youth crime issues? I mean, if you look at some of the things we've seen, such as Operation Victor Unison, I think the police put out, which is the high visibility policing aspect of the government's response. 2 weeks ago, the Commissioner gave a press conference, and she perhaps inadvertently made the admission that operation will have to run for years to come, not months, but years, to try and fix up where we've found ourselves now. Look, I think mandatory sentencing, minimum mandatory sentencing, would address one of the issues that we often hear the government complain about, and that is courts being perceived to fail in doing what community expectations are. So I'm a bit perplexed that they're not prepared to consider it, given the fact that they often criticise the judiciary for not doing what they think they should be doing. But, you can do a quite nuanced response in terms of mandatory sentencing. We now have declarations made in terms of serious repeat offenders under the Youth Justice Act. That's decided on evidence by a judicial officer, so it's an independent assessment. And I would only be proposing that we have minimum mandatory sentencing in relation to serious repeat offenders, that hardcore youth that we continually hear the government refer to.
Terry, I often lament that particular comment that they make about blaming the judiciary for, soft sentencing. When you consider that the Labor government in this state has been in for 30 of the past 34 years, and we didn't come down in the last shower, did we? We know what goes on when it comes to judicial appointments in this state. Magistrates, judges are invariably, well, not invariably, they are always appointed for 30 of the past 34 years by Labor governments, which, suggests that they come from that side of the political fence. So why are they worried about bringing in minimum mandatory sentencing? Is it the fact that the left faction of the Labor Party is opposed to it? Is that essentially it?
Look, I don't know the internal workings of the Labor Party, but certainly the way our government works is that if the government perceives the judiciary are not meeting community expectations and they feel strongly enough about it, all they have to do is take a bill before Parliament to address the shortcomings that they perceive. I mean, and therefore you will guide the discretion of the courts to meet what they think the community expectations are. So the government can rectify this. I mean, to continually lament and blame the judiciary and not do anything about it does seem a bit disingenuous to me. But, this could be a very, very nuanced and specific regime that they could put in place. It's not going to target someone who shop steals 3 Mars bars over 3 months. It's not going to be like the Northern Territory system of 3 strikes, which was quite problematic and a very blunt tool. This could be made very specific and would have an element of discretion that the judiciary could use in relation to who it applies to. So I think the government's been quite closed-minded about it. I mean, raising maximum sentences has no impact. We know from the data in relation to stolen vehicles, for example, I think 15 years' worth of data told us that the maximum sentence a youth offender got was 3 years. The average was 3.6 months. And only 6% of youth offenders got a custodial sentence anyway, so whatsoever.
All right. You mentioned data. Is there any suggestion that youth crime, or crime for that matter, we don't just have to say it's youth crime, is going down, or are we still seeing trends where the data suggests that crime is going up?
Yeah, well, if you look at the government's report, the last report they released, in terms of crime, there was a 14% increase in youth offending, and there were less unique youth offenders. So just to explain that to your listeners, there were less offenders, but there was 14% more crime. So those hardcore offenders are out there committing much more crime and more serious crime. They're overrepresented in terms of robberies, break-and-enters, and stolen vehicles, to the extent that they make up more than 50% of the offenders for those offences, yet they're only 18% of offenders overall. So that data is the official report put out by the government, but of course that was quite delayed by about 9 or 10 months. The latest public data that I've looked off that goes up to the end of this financial year shows that the rate of property crime increased 14%, personal crime went up 15%, and total crime went up 11% in Queensland in terms of the rate. And within that, you've got things like the homicide rate went up 25%, break-and-enters 20%, robberies 12%, and unlawful use of motor vehicles 15%. So we've had 2 years now of major increases.
Terry, final question. Crime, youth crime, has never bent the needle when it comes to changing people's votes at state elections. And we saw that in 2020 when the people voted for the Labor government because they kept them safe during COVID, despite the fact that in a place like Townsville, we were seeing unprecedented spikes in youth crime. Do you think, without a pandemic, on a level playing field, that youth crime, and crime in particular, will play a role at the 2024 election?
I think it will be one of the big ticket items. I think, cost of living will certainly feature, but crime will also feature, I think, front centre here. I mean, when I go down the road here, it's hardly a day goes by that someone doesn't stop me to talk about how it could be fixed or why it got so bad. I mean, I think it's going to be problematic for the government. The issue is, and the role of people like me is, I don't hold to any political persuasion, but I just put out the data that's there. And, if I think there's worthy of a critique in terms of the response, I'll critique it. If I think it's good, I'll say, yeah, it's good. But I think that we could certainly do more than we're doing at the moment. And I don't know how effective our responses will be. And hence probably the reason the Commissioner said that we'll be running operations like Victor Innocent for years to come.
Bond University criminologist and former detective Terry Goldsworthy, always appreciate your time on 4BC Drive.